All right, today we're going to be talking about this long stretch of period that's shaped by empires. And what we're doing, of course, is tracking these underlying processes of globalization that we were talking about. In fact, you can pick almost any empire. If you go into history, this really should be much more about the spread of religions than it is, but I'm focusing on empires because we just have a certain amount of time to do this. It would work with, any of the African empires, any of the empires throughout history, more recent empires, versus even the much older ones. What's an empire? It's a multiplicity of cultures unified under the domination of a single government. It is also variously defined as a system of governance based on conquest. In most of the cases that we know about, this is there's a certain amount of warfare and conflict involved. Foreign peoples, if you have people that are considered foreign to you, ruled by a dynastic, metropolitan, or even in some cases just a clannish state, as long as it meets the state definition. This can be done, we'll see the Mongol clans did it, the Irish clans, or Scottish clans, I should say. There's various different clannish states have developed. It's also the extension of the state's power through the subjugation of other people and the exploitation of their resources. This is the link that I want to make here. We don't just conquer other people for no reason at all. Basically, at the bottom of this, there's economic resource exploitation in all the cases that we know about. This is part of what's going on. So there's a tendency to think of it as just political. No, it has an economic dimension to it. I introduced Sargon last time as the first king of an actual empire, and his Akkadian empire ruled for quite some time. It's 2334 BC to 2083, followed by the Assyrian Empire, the Nubian Empire, the Egyptian Empire. Then you get Alexander the Great conquering the known world, which then sort of becomes the Greek Empire. But he was Macedonian, actually. But he does unifies the known world. The Han Empire, the Persian Empire, really huge, particularly up through 651. Then the Roman Empire, right, turns into a gigantic behemoth of an empire. But these empires influenced each other, and that's where I was sort of left off talking to you last time. The Kush or Nubian Empire, they tended to bury their dead and then build these monuments over the buried people. And we're talking about in the upper reaches of the Nile, very much desert. What happens when you bury somebody in the sand? Sorry, hands? They sink. No. They become desiccated, sort of like your roommate, after a long night of partying. All the fluids leave their body. And they sort of, in the hot sand, self-mummify. And then they get really light, and they tend to float not down, but up. And so some of the earliest resurrection beliefs that we can trace historically go back to this. When people die, they go into the ground, and then they desiccate, they mummify, and they resurrect. It sounds Egyptian, but it's not originally. Okay. So these beliefs, the other thing that is very practical. I used to lecture in Egypt all the time. One of the big problems with burying people in sand is that, the jackals will get to the carcass, and you don't want your ancestors being dug up and eaten by jackals, so what do? Sorry, hand? You fortify it. What they started doing, as far as we can tell in the archaeological record, is you just lay a big stone slab over it, the burial site. It could be, brick or whatever. But the more you honor your ancestors, the bigger the brick, the bigger the slab. And then they start doing 2 slabs and 3 slabs. And you can see that it developed into a particular style of stacking, stones up, and then you would bury the ancestor in there and they would be protected. What does this look like? It looks a little bit like a pyramid. Looks a lot like a pyramid because they're related. They function very much the same way. The ruler and their wealth and all the goods that they would need in the afterlife would be buried in a large pyramid sort of structure. And the early pyramids looked more like these step pyramids. The very early periods were platform on platform on platform. Then they would get finished and then sort of stuccoed down the side. And when these were new or newly created, they would have been smooth and very, impressive, monuments. But you can see the step structure of the pyramids underneath. And so these burial practices sort of carried forward. We have all kinds of pre-colonial empires, many of which we don't know that much about because they existed outside of Western history. But of course, we have the Holy Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, I'm going to talk more about later on, the Great Zimbabwe Empire, which became, like a lot of the African civilizations, was heavily impacted by European trade and slaves. This actually tore up the middle of Africa for quite some time, with the Europeans supplying weapons and alcohol and other things to fuel a slave trade that rocked Africa for 300 plus years, right? The Ottoman Empire plays this really fascinating role between East and West in European history. And it lasted a long time, and it shaped a lot of what was going on, well up really to the First World War. The impact, the imprint of the Ottoman Empire and the way that it pivots between East and West is a huge story that really in our history doesn't get told well enough. The Austrian Empire, the Zulu Empire, the Zulu Empire will appear for us in later lectures, another one of those. And you can go to this graphic online and look at the history of empires that are laid out over the Middle East region time and time again throughout history. And in the end, it shows this like 30-second replay of all the empires that impacted specifically the Middle East, with, Syria and Israel and Egypt being really kind of in the center of this storm of empires that have over 2,000 years swept through this region. Similarly, there's another graphic that looks at the spread of religions and kind of graphs those in much the same way. They're cute graphics, but they also sort of are very telling. When we get to the colonial period, we start to see a new kind of empire, but there's a whole bunch of them. It isn't just one. Typically, people will date the Portuguese Empire with Henry, the navigator and all of that before. But actually, I'm tracking the Spanish in terms of around the Mediterranean. They started to take territories in the Mediterranean, in North Africa, and then out to the Canary Islands. So they were, in fact, before Christopher Columbus sailed, before the Portuguese started exploring down the west coast of Africa, the Spanish had holdings in the Mediterranean already. The Russian Empire spread into North America. The Dutch Empire turns out to be sort of one of the pivotal moments in capitalism. It's right about this 1600 moment that we see what we think of as modern capitalism, with stock markets and trading in commodities. A lot of the functions that are still going on in Wall Street come into play right around this time with the Dutch. So there was the Dutch East India Company, and then there was a British East India Company, and it led to colonial enterprise. You've got to remember that the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Mississippi Colony, those were actually incorporated enterprises that were what we would think of as venture capital today. They were expecting to make money off of those things. The French Empire, you'll still see elements of this. Why are there so many Algerians in Paris, the French say? Well, because the Algerian War, because of colonialism. You can see the influence of French colonialism in Antigua and several places in the Caribbean. And then the American Empire. We'll say, oh, America wasn't an empire. Was it an empire? Hawaii. Cuba and the Philippines. You got to throw on Panama Canal and Guam and a bunch of territories we still own. If you're a Puerto Rican, you're a U.S. citizen, right? But you can't vote for president. What does that mean? That basically Puerto Rico still operated as a colony. It's not that we were an empire, it's that we still are. It's, we still own a lot of those territories from this period. So what I want to do is delve into one particular empire, and I like to use the Mongol Empire for this, well, because I played World of Warcraft and the Horde was an important part of the game, and so we're going to learn about the Mongol Horde because Dr. McCarty is a closet gamer, right? The Mongols were a bunch of herders, sort of disorganized, pressing at the northern frontiers of China, pesky sorts of clans, but they got organized around very strong little family fighting units. They used an iron stirrup, and they became really excellent at being able to ride horses and to be able to sit up and fire bows from the backs of their horses while they're moving. And these abilities as equestrian riders and archers and their tendency to fight in these small clan units that were well coordinated made them really quite formidable in a way that threatened the static defenses that were common throughout the Middle Ages. This fighting sort of system was called the Horde, and it moved very, very quickly. And it was very difficult for the Europeans or ultimately even the Chinese to defend. This is the image, the classic image of the Horde. And because they could move so quickly, they were oftentimes outpacing the news that they were coming. And so in the old feudal system, what you had was a castle, but everybody couldn't live in the castle. There were farms all around the castle. But when you heard that the invaders were coming, everyone would run for the castle and lock themselves in the castle, and you'd hole yourself up in the castle with your supplies of water, and then the invading army would lay siege to the castle and do the whole catapult thing, and it could go on for months, right? The problem with the horde is you never got the news that they were coming until they were already there. This is what you saw. This is the news that the horde's coming. They're barreling down on you at full gallop. Mostly, people didn't make it to the castle. They were just overrun by this. This is a quote from Genghis Khan. The greatest joy a man can know is to conquer his enemies and drive them before him, to ride their horses and take away their possessions, to see the faces of those who are dear to them bedewed with tears, and to clasp their wives and daughters in their arms. He's not like the kind of guy you want to invite to dinner, right? I'm not saying that Genghis Khan was a real gentleman or anything. He was, when he had to be, a brutal conqueror. But there are some interesting characteristics to the Mongol Empire that we want to look at. After a long period of intertribal conflict and intrigue, Temujin, and that was his name, succeeded in the unprecedented feat of unifying all the Mongol tribes. And so he brought all of the clans together. He had to defeat his brother to actually pull this off. But finally, the Mongol tribes were unified. And they declared him the Khan of Khans, and he was given the name Genghis Khan in 1206. Now, this date's not really on the quiz or anything. I don't want you to worry about the specific dates, but just watch the sequence here, right? In 1206, stuff starts to happen. In 1211, they begin the conquest of China. 1214, they sort of get the northern part of China. And I want to remind you, before the Mongol Empire, this is what the region looked like. It was a complicated tapestry of different cultures and languages. If anything, this map understates the amount of variety that was in there. You got Kashmir clearly marked there, areas that would become Afghanistan and eventually Persia and the Middle East. But it wasn't unified. Most of these people weren't even really that much in contact with each other directly. There were the trade routes and whatnot. But there was a tremendous amount of variety there. That is until, Temujin becomes Genghis Khan. So he goes into northern China by 1214. He's raided in there. Here we're looking at 1207, 1218, and they're just sweeping, in this horde sort of fashion down through Asia. He begins a war with Persia. The thing about Genghis Khan is he would send his emissaries to you and say, hey, surrender to me and I'll let you keep your title and you'll just have to pay, a certain amount of taxes to me and everything will be fine. If you resisted Genghis Khan, then he was utterly brutal and he would exterminate you. And so he sends his emissaries off to talk to the Persians and give them this ultimatum. And they killed the messenger. This is the saying, don't kill the messenger. Why? Because you piss off Genghis Khan when you kill his messengers. So it became a war of annihilation. Genghis Khan actually created a detachment specifically to pursue that Shah across his own empire and kill him. It's very personal when you defy Genghis Khan in this way. What happened was he pushed an enormous amount of population out of Central Asia into the Middle East. Just the horde and running from the horde and the fear involved. When he finally conquered Persia, then he started to circle the Caspian Sea. Here we are. These are my high-tech graphics. There he is, circling the Caspian Sea, right? So we're looking at Europe. Genghis Khan's really on the doorstep. He's in Eastern Europe. They conquered Russia. That's like a no small thing. Russia's what, 11 different time zones? It's enormous, right? Running from Genghis Khan, the Cumans went to Hungary and they said, give us asylum. The horde is chasing us. And Hungary said, cool, we grant you asylum. This pissed off Genghis Khan because he was after the Cumans. If you give the people he's after asylum, well, then you come under attack. And so the Mongols attacked Hungary in 1241 when they refused to give up the Cumans, right? Within 3 months, the Genghis Khan and the Mongols had basically obliterated all military resistance in much of Eastern Europe. There was effectively no defense. All that, chivalry and knights and whatnot, but at this period, the Mongol horde was fighting a type of warfare that the static defenses of Europe were almost useless against. He could break sieges. He would, for example, one of his tricks was to take plague-ridden bodies and catapult them into your castle. He actually might have contributed to the spread of the plague in this way. But the images of people's heads being on sticks and everything, that sort of brutality was very common. So here we are, right? We got Eastern Europe, and Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire is on the verge of taking Western Europe. If the guy just took a left here, we would probably be speaking some version of Mongol at this moment. All of Western European history would be different. But for some reason, he didn't go into Western Europe. There's nothing there that would have stopped him, as far as we can tell. Why didn't he go in? Well, sorry, I got ahead of myself. The problem is that Temujin died. Genghis Khan died after this long sweep through Asia, the Middle East, and into Eastern Europe. The great Khan finally died. And in Mongol tradition, when the Khan dies, what do? You take him home and you bury him. And that's basically what they did with Genghis Khan. It's not really clear how he died. People always want to know, how did he die? There's not much history on that. They halted their attack that could have led to the fall of all of Europe, and they went home, and they never again invaded in Europe. There's several successions of Khans, and there's a consolidation, and there are other expansions in the empire, but it's just historical coincidence that it didn't include Western Europe. So we see several Khans in there. Kublai Khan shows up for us. Most of the other Khans, we don't really know much about, don't pay attention to, right? What resulted was the single largest empire in the history of the human race in terms of its square miles. Right? Remember the area that I showed you that was a patchwork? Well, this is an enormous area that came under Mongol control. And they were various Khanates. Up in the left, you'll see the Golden Horde. That's what we think of as Russia today. So it was Genghis Khan and, the empire that founded Moscow as a major trading post, for example. But Russia would not be what Russia is without the Mongols having arrived. Down here you have the Ilkhanate, which turns into Persia, more or less. Chagatai Khanate, which would include Central Asia and Afghanistan, and that region that through the next several hundred years would be considered sort of pivotal. Anybody play Risk? Yeah, there's a nerd or two in here. But I grew up playing Risk on a board game, believe it or not. It wasn't even a computer game. But this central part of Asia was in what was called the Great Game at the time for the British, was very important in terms of controlling access to Asia via land routes. And so you can see this in the board game Risk. You'll notice in Risk that water is an obstacle, and they were thinking in terms of land-based empires. And so this Central Asian piece of the puzzle was considered strategic. And so the British were in Afghanistan for a long time. And then you have China and Mongolia under Genghis Khan, right? So this turns into being the largest contiguous empire in the history of the world. It covered almost 13 million square miles, 22% of the Earth's total land area, and more than 100 million people. This is an estimated 25% of the world's population at that time. There weren't that many people around. The human population didn't hit 1 billion until fairly recently. Now we're looking at 7, 8 billion coming up real soon. But this was a huge piece of it, and lots of cultures were influenced. And this is one of the reasons why a huge portion of the population of Earth has some Mongol genes. It's something like 60% of all people on Earth have some trace of Mongol genes in their blood, and it's because of this empire. So it was profoundly impactful in a lot of ways. Why were they so successful? Well, it was their expertise and their endurance. Incredible. They lived on their horses, and they could ride all day long at a gallop. And so they're covering 100 miles a day, outstripping all forms of communication at that point. And being able to coordinate in this way at that speed was just unheard of. They were able to coordinate across hundreds and thousands of miles using their riders. They could time their attacks to come in from the north and the south. This long-distance coordination, just in terms of the distances across which they were coordinating, wasn't really paralleled again until World War I. So it would be hundreds of years before this kind of coordination happened again. You could say World War II, but really World War I was a little more contained. We call it a world war, but it wasn't precisely. The Mongols employed very practical, readily assimilated, advanced siege technology. Whatever they encountered, they would use. If you had carpenters, they would use them. If you were a good administrator that didn't resist them, they would leave you in administration. They put everyone to work. And they assimilated whatever technologies were there. They were very flexible and adaptable in this regard. And so they developed these new siege technologies that really just made a mockery of European defenses. At the same time, they had a code. Anybody that played World of Warcraft knows the Horde had a code. And there was a sense of honor and loyalty, and they respected others that didn't, resist them. And even their worst enemies and their opponents had to admit that, in fact, the Mongols had the mark of civilization. If you watch sci-fi, and if you're in my class, you have to watch sci-fi, particularly Star Trek The Next Generation, then you would know that the marker of civilization is, do you follow your own rules? This is what defines civilization. And the Mongols were known to follow their own rules. They had a sense of honor. In fact, business thrived under the Mongols. For a lot of minorities that were suppressed, oppressed religious minorities, the Mongols didn't care what you believed. They practiced a kind of religious freedom. And so for a lot of the religious minorities, the Mongols showing up was seen as a kind of liberation. And they did better under the Mongols than they did under many of the other empires that were conquered. The Silk Road was stabilized under the Mongols. It was reinforced, stabilized, and worked better than it had before. They were not disruptive in the sense that, it wasn't just chaos and disorder. They ran by their own rules, and it operated just fine. So they were utterly ruthless when they encountered resistance. They used all kinds of terror tactics. They were generally benevolent in the absence of resistance. There was very little corruption under Genghis Khan because, the price of pissing off the Khan was very, very high. And so they were left under the control of native governors who tended to, play nicer and be more honest under the Mongols than they had been before. They accorded a relatively high status to women. It wasn't equality in the way that we would think of it today, but women had a relatively high status, contributed importantly to Mongol society, and became a very serious resource. And so they were very efficient in this regard. They were known to be less corrupt, more benign than many of the governments that they conquered. So, and we see this, in the historical record. The people were terrified of the Mongols would say, at least they're good at what they do. The rulers of Russia, Persia, Central Asia, in effect became regents to the Khan in China. And so the administration of this gigantic empire led to these 4 regions being specified out. China and Mongolia were the Great Khanate. Central Asia became the Shagadai, I don't really know how to pronounce it, Khanate. Russia became the Golden Horde, and Persia became the Ilkhanate. And these administrative regions of the Mongol Empire persisted for some time, and when the Mongol Empire finally came apart, these regions were left standing, shaped by Genghis Khan in the beginning. And so the world as we know it, these lines were drawn by this empire. So what's the legacy of the Mongol Empire? Well, it's probably greater than you're thinking. The political stability of the east of the Silk Road allowed it to transfer a lot more goods across the region, leading to an intensification, of integration. He depopulated an entire region in Central Asia, some 30 million people, and pushed many of those out, of Asia into what will become Persia and Iran. He made Moscow a major trading center because of its location. They introduced a writing system that was common across the Silk Road and in the region. And they discovered something very cool. The Chinese had invented paper money. Up to this point, we're out there trading, shells and beads and gold coins or silver, and money was heavy, and you sort of had to carry it with you. It was a lot of shells or a lot of bananas that you had to carry with you to do trade. Well, the Chinese had worked out that you could do a promissory note. In effect, if you bring this note to the government, it's worth 10 silver. this we would think of as currency. And so they had invented paper currency. And it was way more efficient to just print out these promissory notes called bills and do business trading these government notes around. And so Genghis Khan thought, wow, well, that's kind of cool. And they pick up this paper money and deliver it across the Silk Road into the Middle East and eventually on to Europe. And so every time you use paper money, which you guys are almost past now, it's only Dr. McCarty that pulls out his wallet and actually pays for my lunch down at the grill here. You guys just wave plastic at it or your iPhones at it. But if you do go to the ATM and you do actually take out bills, then you should stop for a moment and thank Genghis Khan, because he's the one that delivered paper money to the West. He may have also delivered the Black Death to Europe, or at least played a role in delivering the Black Death to Europe, which is an important moment in our history, of European history, and it changed a lot of things. It was a terrible death event, but it also led to a certain flourishing that would contribute ultimately to, say, the scientific revolution and whatnot. So these, Genghis Khan and the Mongol horde is just one example. I like to use this example because it's not Western. All we know about the Mongols is the stereotypes. We don't realize mostly what an important role they played in history. So it's always good to encounter a certain amount of non-Western history. But like any empire, it shows us these processes that I'm talking about. It vastly increased the contact between the ruling and the ruled. Empires do this all the time. You can't have an empire without moving your armies and your administrators and some of their families into the region. You don't have an empire without the people that were conquered showing up in your capital. This happens. Why are the Algerians in, Paris? Well, because that's what happens. Why did Filipinos come to the United States? Well, the whole wave of it you can trace to the American-Philippine War, or the American-Korean War, or the Vietnam War. Any time you go into fight a war on somebody else's turf, you're going to get immigration. It happens. It has always happened. So the total amount of integration that happens as a result of this empire process, if you include the return migration and whatnot, is really quite extensive. The influence in terms of technologies of administration and centers of power, symbols of power like these big burial sites that we're talking about, the scepter. Why does the Queen in England still have a scepter? Why do we have columns on our buildings in Washington? Where do we get this idea of columns from? Why do you have to have marble columns? The ones that are fluted, that have the little ridges in them? We got it from Greece. Rome. Greece got it from Egypt. Where did the Egyptians get it from? So the scepter thing clearly goes back to Egypt. Well, it turns out in the Tigris and Euphrates Delta, there's not a lot of wood around, and what they would do to make their great houses of government is they would weave the reeds together and make these columns. And they became symbols of power. And so it'd be like papyrus or reeds, columns. And in fact, you can still find in Egypt columns that have this sort of bulbous shape, and they're called reed columns, but they were carved in stone to imitate the earlier reed columns. And then the Greeks picked it up from the Egyptians, the Romans picked it up from the Greeks, and in the neoclassical moment, we think we're copying the Greeks, but we're not actually. We're copying, early Mesopotamians. And so these symbols of power, including how we do burials, crowns go all the way back in a similar sort of way. So we're copying and echoing things that developed in the very earliest moments of civilization. Our earliest writing systems have to do often with empire and who conquered who. These are some of our earliest histories, royal lineages, tales of conquest, carved monuments. You see these large stones carved with the genealogies of kings. Really New World and Old World. So, this is not just our actual history, but it's how history itself gets started, even as a field. We see the spread of belief systems. All the major religions of the world today have lineages. We can trace belief systems back to earlier, Zoroastrian, whatever. The beliefs in the afterlife, resurrection, whatnot. We can trace these through the great global religions of the world through what was called the Axial Age. Those religions were largely put together with parts and pieces, belief systems that predate the formation of the global religions. And even ambitions can be globalized in this way. Genghis Khan was a model for subsequent conquerors. He was referenced by Hitler, who admired the speed and brutality of Genghis Khan and Alexander the Great. And so even ideas about empire and how to rule the world, those can be handed down and influence the history. So let's think a little bit about exploration, not just warfare. There's another element of this is we kind of want to know what's out there. Sometimes it's military, sometimes it's just, because we want to do trade or we want to learn. There was this sort of dark ages, we call it, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Western Church. The Ottomans would disagree. The Eastern Church continued on. This didn't really impact North Africa or the rest of the world. It was just a Western European Roman Catholic sort of dark ages. Around 870, the Vikings start to explore. We know they get as far as Iceland, may have got to North America by 1000. We're pretty sure Leif Erikson's in Newfoundland, so he's on the continent by the year 1000. China develops the maritime compass in 1117, and this really makes it much more possible, much safer to start doing ocean sailing. And so the maritime compass leads to an explosion of sailings. We have the revival of exploration in the 1200s by the Chinese, Muslims, and the Venetian Empire. The Republic of Venice turns out to be a really important access point to the Silk Road and to these other empires for Europe. At that time, Italy, Venice specifically, got very wealthy trading to the Middle East, to the Far East, and wealth would flow into Europe through Venice. I went to Venice this summer. It was totally cool, worth going to, mobbed with tourists, though. Throughout this period, there were many, many achievements that were not specifically European, right? This is the Dark Ages, but you have the Book of Roger, 1154, which was a survey of all known lands. Ibn Battuta was one of the most celebrated Muslim explorers, went to India and to China. is it Chenghe? Chenghe? I don't know the pronunciation. 1405. This is, major expeditions that the Chinese sent out, 7 of them with dozens of ships to India, to East Africa. These were huge ships, like 300 feet long, whole armadas, floating armadas of ships, and they did far explorations, right? The Christians' crusades to the Holy Land really started around 1095, and we don't link this often to colonialism and empires, but they're intricately tied together. It's at this moment the Pope justifies the taking away of Muslim lands, the Holy Land, and to recapture the Holy Land from the Muslims. What he does is the Pope declares land that's not owned by Christians to be virtually unoccupied. Terra nullius is the term. And so you can take away any lands that belong to anyone that are not Christian. And this begins excursions into Muslim territories in the Holy Land, and then into North Africa, and then into the Atlantic islands and beyond, right? Marco Polo goes wandering off to China, comes back with the noodle, and Italians, they start liking the pasta from then on, right? But his description of the world was a sensation, not particularly accurate. It's not even clear that he went to all the places he said he went to, but it sparked European imagination for traveling the Silk Road, for reaching the Far East and the fabulous wealth in the Far East. This is the moment, shows up in Shakespeare as the Merchants of Venice, right? This is the moment where the Venetian Republic dominated this trade. Venice turns out to be a very good, very defensible position, tucked the way that it is back into the region. It's very hard to attack by sea. And so the Venetians end up developing a very powerful navy, and they manage to control all this trade. The Renaissance migrated on to Florence. It gets a sort of boost that we'll see in a little while, and there's a sort of second flowering in the Renaissance, and that's centered more around Florence than it is around Venice. What's the most important date that you probably don't know anything about? This one, 1453. When 9/11 happened, I was on a cruise ship lecturing about the Crusades in Greece and Turkey, and on my way to Alexandria in Egypt. And I was lecturing on this stuff. Why? Because I'll do anything to get on a free ride on a cruise ship. And B, this history fascinates me. But at this point, Constantinople, Istanbul, that we would think of as today, is the obvious place for the Crusaders that want to go from Europe into the Holy Land. You had to go through that strait. And so Constantinople is the transfer point. Right? This is how the Crusaders, you have to go through Turkey, you have to go through Constantinople. And after the Fourth Crusade, or whenever it was, in fact, the Ottoman Empire decided they'd had enough of this. They didn't want the Europeans coming back into the Holy Land and invading again. And so they took Constantinople in a major siege. And when Constantinople fell in 1453, this caused a major crisis in Europe because it cut off, Europe's access to the Silk Road. The Silk Road being the land route, but also all that sea trade. So access to the Middle East falls. You don't get access then to the wealth of the Far East. And so it's like cutting off the supply of silk and wealth and spices from the Spice Islands, lots of things. In fact, Europeans, it was during the Crusades that Europeans discovered sugar, which had been invented in India centuries before. The Chinese learned how to make it. They sent emissaries to learn how to make it. And so it wasn't until the Crusades that Europeans found sugar in the Holy Land. What happens to a European when you cut off their supply of sugar? Very grumpy. At least that's how it is for me. So it wasn't just commodities, though. Up to this point, slaves had been supplied through this line, and they were trading slaves out of Central Asia. There was no association between slavery and Africa. Slaves up to this point were largely supplied. Whites from Eastern Europe had been really for centuries. And slavery was this kind of thing where you could be bought out, and slaveholders could hold office, that you were in debt. You were an indentured servant in a way, but you weren't genetically, racistly a slave. So slavery was a different institution during this time, and it was largely a white or Asian institution and wasn't affiliated with Africa or skin color precisely. So we have a crisis in Europe, and they have to get reconnected to the wealth of the Far East. How do you do it? Christopher Columbus people. Actually, what the Spanish did was they went into North Africa and they tried to work around the Ottoman Empire, figuring that they could go into North Africa and through Africa reach around. And so those early colonies, in fact, in North Africa. But in the end, they had to sail off and, keep going west. They had to explore, and they were desperate to try and reach the Silk Road and reconnect all of that trade. So here we get what we call our age of exploration, right? You got Diaz, Magellan, Christopher Columbus. And what happened was basically the Portuguese had got into Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And the Spanish got into the game. They already had, territory in the Canary Islands there. You can see Vasco da Gama and the Canary Islands in green. And what the Pope did was said, well, following this terra nullius idea that was established in the Crusades, we're going to declare the whole world terra nullius. And the Portuguese explorers can have everything to the east, and the Spanish could have everything to the west. And so the line drawn happened to include Brazil. So it included Brazil, and everything east went to the Portuguese. So this came out as a papal bull, and the world was divided up. And in a flash, in this moment, the die was cast for colonialism. Right? And we see the Spanish going one way, and the Portuguese going the other way. And when they both spread all the way around the world, if you reach around the globe, and where do your fingers come together on the other end of the globe? Turns out Manila. And Manila is sort of the pivot point in this. We'll get to that story a little farther on. So we start to see seaborne trade that was dependent upon navigational charts and instruments, the astrolabe, the quadrant. Knowledge of the winds and currents turn out to be a very important thing. Shipbuilding design, in your reading, you'll find that, in fact, the Spanish had to borrow a lot of knowledge and shipbuilding expertise from the native Filipinos to learn how to, reliably cross and navigate the Pacific. They didn't really have that technology. Naval gunnery. From this moment, it starts to matter that you have guns to protect your ships, to stop pirates, to take over ports, to defend ports. And naval guns start getting bigger and bigger, right up through World War II, with, the big battleships. These naval guns play an important role in this. A new kind of a ship called the caravel. And you think, oh, the caravel's a European invention. No, what it did was it combined the old square sails with the lateen sails that had been used for centuries on the Nile. And the triangular lateen sails actually allow you to sail closer into the wind. With the big square sails, you're pretty much getting pushed downwind. And you had to wait for wind direction to change and blow back the other way before you could sail home. With the lateen or triangular sails, then you can really control where you go and when much better. You have much more directional control, and you can sail in very close into the direction of the wind. So these technologies then increase the amount of ocean-going trade, the total amount of ocean-going trade. 1420, you get Prince Henry. Diaz goes around the Cape of Good Hope. And one of the problems here is that the Portuguese, they start sailing down the west coast of Africa. They get to the Congo, and they discover, anyone? Gold. The Portuguese discovered gold in the Congo, and they set off a global gold rush. The conquistadors were looking for gold in Mexico. They were looking for gold in South America, right? Because the status of Portugal amongst its European neighbors went way up. They had found gold in one of their colonies, the Congo, right? When did European powers stop mining in the Congo? Anyone? Hasn't happened yet. We're still in the Congo mining stuff. Where does your coltan come from? Slave labor in the Congo. Coltan. Why do we care about coltan? You guys look at me like, ugh. Every iPhone has slave labor produced coltan in it to this day. Eastern Congo mines run by warlords with slave labor. So this process that we're talking about here is not over. Vasco da Gama goes into the Indian Ocean and militarizes the entire Indian Ocean. Some clown called Amerigo Vespucci, he's not even like the captain or anything. He's on the deck of one of these boats floating around the Caribbean, and he looks over and he goes, oh, what's that? And so the entire continent of North America gets named after Amerigo. Luckiest son of a gun. Who's this? This hottie is Beatriz de Bobadilla. Beatriz was the governor of the Canary Islands. And what had happened is the Spanish had started growing sugarcane in the Mediterranean, in the few places in the Mediterranean that were okay for sugarcane. But they had lost their sugar supply, right? And you could make a lot of money with sugar. Selling sugar to Europeans is still a very profitable business. If it's a soda pop or, a sour gummy or whatever it is. But even back then, selling sugar to Europeans was good business. And so they were trying to grow sugarcane, and she had got to the Canary Islands and had started growing sugarcane, and they started to use slaves from Africa. And so here was the, governess of the Canary Islands, Beatriz de Bobadilla, growing sugarcane with slaves when guess who comes sailing by? Christopher Columbus. You have to go through the Canary Islands if you want to get to the New World. If you're in the Canary Islands and you threw a toy boat in the water, the winds and the currents blow it around and it washes up where? In the Caribbean. Puerto Rico, in this case, Christopher Columbus washed up on the island of Hispaniola, which is now, Haiti and Dominican Republic. But before he actually did this, he had to stop and refuel, because the Canary Islands were the last stop before you threw yourself into the Atlantic and hope you washed up somewhere important. He met the governess Beatriz de Bobadilla, and according to locals on the island, there was a steamy affair. There's no historical evidence to support this. But what we do know is he spent an inordinate amount of time in the Canary Islands. The Spanish there were already growing sugar using slaves. It took Christopher Columbus a month to refuel, apparently. And Beatriz sends him off with a sugarcane cutting and some African slaves and says, if you happen to run into any place good to grow sugar, we can make bank on this. That's an exact quote. She said, we can make bank on this. And so Christopher Columbus throws himself to the winds and the tides, and he washes up in the Caribbean on the island of Hispaniola. And what do you know? It's great sugar growing territory, right? And so slavery and sugarcane and trade, within 50 years, the natives, the Taino Indian natives of the island are extinct, wiped out, right? But we do know that Christopher Columbus returned to the Canary Islands 3 times. Spent a lot of time there. Ferdinand Magellan circumnavigates the world. And what happens is we start to see a lot of trade between the New World and not just Europe. But a lot of trade starts to flow from the New World, North and South America, directly to China. At this time, the Spanish were mining a great deal of silver out of the mines in South America. And the Chinese were using tons of silver. They couldn't get enough of it, making coins and silver plating things, and it was just like an endless amount of silver wanted in China. And so this is part of the history that we don't have very good records on and we don't know very much about. But through the 300 or 400 years of the colonial period, an enormous amount of materials moved directly from the New World to China without going through Europe. And so they had to build a port. They needed a huge transshipment port for this trade to China. And they established this port in Manila, 1565. And it's at that moment then that the galleon trade really takes off, all of this trade to the New World. And all the trade routes, remember the East and West trade routes, they come together. The Spanish meet the Portuguese in Manila. The New World meets the Old World in Manila. There was a small fishing port there, but there was nothing like this, the international port that was called into being by world trade. And so you can find papers on this. A lot of people consider this to be the moment of globalization. This is when all the continents started to trade directly with each other, when there was enough tonnage flowing directly from the New World to China. This is the moment of the globalization of world trade. In the physical sense of continents trading directly with each other. And what happens in this is that we sort of shift from our old land-based ideas to a more global, oceanic kind of seafaring that involved all the continents. It redefined our space, and it allowed the world to enter into a new, much more oceanic kind of history. And every continent was shaped by this history. It wasn't just that, Europe influenced Asia, or that Asia influenced the New World, or they were all entering a new global history that influenced each other. And it creates this kind of shared global history. First time. And it also inaugurates a kind of reversal of perspectives that I think is really important. Remember the old land-based empire and the risk? Water's an obstacle here, and you had to go over land to get from one place to another. Well, if you turn the globe around and look at it in a particular way, you see that it's, mostly water. I'm going to skip that quote. Particularly if you foreground the Pacific, then, it's an ocean planet. So we went from a flat world, a land-based world, to a world that was round and really full of water. When was the next time that we had our perspective so radically changed? Hang on, you're always in on. Somebody else? Flight? Space? Most people, my students oftentimes comes up with, the internet, because that's, the answer for everything. Flight and space, of course, are sort of the same, but actually with flight, we didn't get really high enough. It's not until Apollo 8. They're up there trying to take a picture of the moon. It's kind of awkward in the little capsule looking out the little port. You got your old Instamatic camera and you're trying to take a picture of the moon's surface because no one had a picture of the moon's surface yet. And so they snap this picture of the moon's surface. What's the most interesting thing in the picture? It ain't the moon's surface. It's Earth. Before this, there are no depictions of the Earth as a cloud-covered planet. We always painted it brown and green, and we didn't understand how the cloud cover would look from space. And so there aren't any paintings or drawings or images of the Earth looking like this. It's at this moment that we realize that the third rock from the sun is very, very small. And our world gets very, very tiny. And so think about all the things that we need to live. Our whole civilization is based on what? Oil. Is there any oil on the moon? Oil is fossilized life forms, mostly ocean life forms. We say dinosaurs. But lots of plants and mostly little ocean crustaceans. They die, they fall to the bottom of the ocean, they get crushed, and all the carbon becomes oil. Are we going to find oil on any planet? Some of you say yes, some of you say no, but it ain't going to be local. It's not on the moon. The oxygen atmosphere that makes the Earth what it is, was that always there? No. In fact, that's not the first atmosphere of Earth. The oxygen atmosphere was produced by life forms. Oxygen that we breathe and live in is a byproduct of other forms, largely oceanic, that produce oxygen as a waste product. These are like dinosaur farts, or oxygen. And then we evolved within this new oxygen atmosphere. Any other oxygen atmospheres out there? Is there anything out there that we really need? Some minerals, maybe. Well, mostly we got all the minerals we need. But this little lifeboat, and seeing it this way, really changed our understanding of the world. It was a profound shift in our perspective. The very next year, you get Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and the environmental movement. The things just started to change because the world got really small. By 1972, they did this composite image called the Blue Marble image. And this is your logo for anything environmental. If you want to make something and call it an environmental product, you got to stick this logo on there. It is the most reproduced image in the history of the Earth. Right? Our little blue marble image. So this Earthrise picture of 1968 really profoundly changed our perspective. And my point is that perspectives matter. What perspectives you hold change what you can know, how you look at things, the angle that you look at them from matters. And there's always multiple perspectives, particularly in global studies. So our perspectives are plural, and they change. They change over time. Your perspective will change over time. It should change over time. This is part of why we go to college, right? So, we had the Christopher Columbus moment, and then we had the Earthrise moment. When's the next time after this when we had our perspective radically altered? The pale blue dot image is a good one. I like that. But when we finally got a spacecraft far enough away to see Earth as a pale little blue dot lost in the Milky Way, that was kind of a moment for us little peoples. Hubble telescope. See, that's why I don't call on this guy. The Hubble Ultra Deep Field Survey was done. Some guy got a grant to point the Hubble telescope at nothing. I write these grants, they don't give me anything. This guy writes a grant, I'm going to point the most expensive telescope at nothing and take a picture. He got money for this. How do they do this? I don't know. They do a very long exposure and they come up with this image. And what's so radical about this image? Other than the one star, the rest of those are not stars. They're galaxies. What Hubble captured was not just a whole bunch of stars in our Milky Way, but an infinite number of galaxies receding into the distance. Each one is big, sometimes bigger, than our own galaxy. We estimate that there are 200 billion observable galaxies like ours, each one with hundreds of millions of stars. See you next time.